I remember the book Sideways Stories from Wayside School being a big part of my childhood. It's one of the many books that I read to my siblings, and we were delighted by the strange and surreal stories about a school that was built on its side, and the classroom on the very top, the 30th floor, of many strange little kids. It had its own strange set of logic. One of the more memorable chapters was that of Marissa. In it, the teacher, Mrs. Jules, had brought in a special ice cream named after Marissa because she had gotten tired of all the traditional flavors. Everyone loved it, except Marissa. That's because the ice cream tasted like what Marissa tasted when she tasted nothing. It makes sense in a very childlike way. And many people have asked similar questions like, does blue look the same to me as it does for everyone else? What if everyone else sees blue as I see red? Each of the three books had stories that tapped into a similar set of entertaining bizarreness. From a student named Sammy who wore 1,000 smelly coats and when they were all removed, revealed nothing more than a dead rat. The third one that had tried to sneak into Mrs. Jules' class. Or Joe, who would always count using random numbers, but would always arrive at the correct answer of a math problem. Or Rondi, who everyone complimented on having two beautiful front teeth, even though her two front teeth were missing. The books were written by Louis Sachar, best known for Holes. He had started working on the idea about a mean teacher who turned her students into apples while in high school, but the idea for the Wayside series of books didn't really form until he worked as a teacher's assistant in college. And if I remember correctly, the names are based on kids he worked with, although their personalities are obviously very different. The prose of the books speaks to kids on their level, without really talking down to them, making the series really easy for a kid to get into, and uses very fun and odd wordplay, like, the basement is where the dead rats lived. I bring this all up because this show, Wayside, was one that I was actually excited for. Much of what I reviewed on Animated Atrocities I've come across incidentally, or I went looking for it. This is one of them that came to me, even though it was getting towards what I'd consider to be the end of my childhood. Wayside, the show, originally aired on Teletoon in 2005, but it didn't make its way to Nickelodeon until the summer of 2008. And it was probably one of the first of my long list of disappointments with Nick, even though they're really not the one to blame for this one. To put this in perspective, the original book, Sideways Stories from Wayside School, was written in 1978. And when reading the book, you would get the impression that it would make for an absolutely stellar cartoon. It already had the logic that would grow to inhabit cartoons starting in the mid-90s, with many characters that you'd love to know better and get more and more stories with. And the books were already episodic. Even better is that the books were absolutely timeless, with the exception of the names like Marissa and Nancy, names that I don't think that anyone has had in about 20 years. I first read the books in the 90s, and I did not know that the original was written in the late 70s until I looked it up, because it's one of the few stories that truly feels like it could have taken place at any time. I did have a lot of high hopes for this cartoon, and I watched it, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it was definitely a very poor adaptation. I gave an episode of review a couple of years back to explain what a poor adaptation I thought that it was. Recently, I tried to watch it again and view it on its own merits, and I tried to like this show. I really did. Welcome to my first revisited marathon, where I take a look at some of the cartoons and episodes that I don't think I did proper justice the first time around, and I thought that I'd start with one of the easier ones first. We're going to be talking about Wayside both on its own and as an adaptation. I think it deserves to be looked at both ways, and I want to be as fair as possible. And yes, I'm sorry, but we have to look at this as an adaptation. A lot of people who have never read the books really like the show, and I'm assuming that they're very annoyed at people who keep hating on the show because it pales in comparison to the books. However, I want to be as fair as possible. So, this time, an absolute rarity, we're not going to be talking about one episode. I'm going to do something new and try to give the entire series a review. Not episode by episode, just the entire series in general. All of the episodes are on a similar level of quality. There's none that stands out as being, say, Wayside's The Splinter. While Wayside is counted as an official Nicktoon, Teletoon holds the responsibility for creating the show. And knowing what I know now, that should have been my first red flag. I don't think that I've stated this before, but I really don't like Teletoon. I mean, that should be obvious with how many Teletoon shows that I've reviewed up to this point, and how many that I'm going to continue to review in the future. And I think that Teletoon might actually be the single-handed reason that Canadian animation has such a rock-bottom reputation in this day and age. I mean, as bad as Nick and Cartoon Network have gotten, they've never managed to basically create a bad impression of an entire country's animation department. Because Canadian animation isn't as bad as many people claim it to be. Ed, Edd n Eddy was a Canadian show. Friendship is Magic is a Canadian show. Reboot. And Canadian animation tends to be even better when it's an international effort, like with Clone High or Cyber 6. No, the problem is that Teletoon, a Canadian network, generates a lot of shit. And they export a lot of shit. Teletoon shows tend to be people's first impression on Canadian animation. They started in the late 90s with a stellar lineup of Caillou, Donkey Kong Country, Bad Dog, Mega Babies, and Angela Anaconda. This is the network behind the perennial classics, Johnny Test, My Life Me, The Day My Butt Went Psycho, Rocket Monkeys, and Looped. With that pedigree, who wouldn't trust them with their franchise? They create a lot of garbage because, best that I can see, that's their strategy. Give a little bit of money to a lot of people. Even their better shows like Total Drama have a very, we made this as quickly as possible in Flash to get this out as quickly as possible aesthetic. Teletoon shows tend to use a lot of simple shapes and little else, not really focusing on any details. They almost universally look lazy, especially with the advent of Flash and computer animation. I mean, their most recent shows, like Looped, look far worse than their older shows, like Totally Spies and Caillou. Cartoons from a network should look better than the ones from the past, not worse. Wayside started out as hand-drawn, and eventually moved on to Flash, but it's honestly hard to tell the difference, especially because they do reuse a lot of animation. I really don't like the look of this show. I mean, it does look better than it would have if it came out in 1978, but that's not saying much considering the animation of 1978. And Wayside kind of came out in the second worst possible time it could have, the mid-2000s. A time when almost everything looked really cheap. Now, the books had several editions with several illustrations from various different artists. The one that I grew up with was illustrated by Julie Brickenlow, and goddamn do I wish I could find another copy of this version. The current versions out now are illustrated by Adam McCauley, and while the newer drawings do fit the tone of the series better, I prefer the original. I think the surreality of the books hit a lot harder when it's coming from people that look like actual people. So, there really is no canon version of what these characters look like. Well, there is, which the Wayside show does occasionally screw up, like Sherry's overcoat being red and blue and Steven having green hair. I'm not too flustered about the choice in appearance. What I don't like is that the characters seem overly simple, and they can't be expressive without their entire body going berserk. Speaking of that, the actual expressions of the show do look uncomfortably uncanny. This is noticeable even from the theme song. Look at how constipated this cow appears, and Myron's expression here, it just looks wrong. Half of the time, it looks like they're confusing the keyframes for the in-betweens. And if you marathon this show like I have, they reuse a lot of animation. There's a montage of Marissa hitting Todd that they reuse a couple of times, for instance. But speaking of the theme song, credit where it's due, I love how this sounds. I mean, speaking of not giving things the credit that they were due, I seriously believe that this should have been more than an honorable mention on my top 20 best theme songs of all time. It's just so cheery and upbeat, and it never fails to put me in a good mood, and it is one of the cartoon theme songs that I do listen to on its own, detached from the show. It's outstandingly catchy. The only thing bad about it is that it's used for the Wayside cartoon. That wasn't really a joke. It ends up delivering a promise that it can't live up to. From a really energetic theme song to really stilted animation. And my praise of the sound direction ends there, because pretty much all of the background music seems to be stolen. Whenever they do something action-packed, say Jenny or Marissa do a stunt, the show will play an instrumental version of Eye of the Tiger. Not something that sounds like Eye of the Tiger, but actually an instrumental version of Eye of the Tiger. Which makes the show seem even cheaper. This happens so much that I'm honestly surprised that no one got sued, because it's not the only song they use instrumental versions of. What we have so far is a show that doesn't use its own plot, premise, or characters, it reuses animation that it doesn't put much effort into, and it steals music. Forgetting that this is based on a book, I expect better production values out of cartoons in general. This honestly feels like it's in the Johnny Test area. The series follows Todd, who is a new student in Mrs. Jewell's class. In my original review, I had a problem with this, and I still do. Todd's main gimmick, if you will, is that every day he gets in trouble 3 times and ends up being sent home on the kindergarten bus. This is a problem in the show for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that it sends him away from the wackiness of Wayside early, when the show is about Todd experiencing the wackiness of Wayside. The other reason is that it leads to the show being a lot more one note. Much of the humor is just beating on Todd. For example, in Age of the Aquarium, Todd isn't allowed on a field trip because he didn't get a permission slip signed, because it was given out after he was sent home on the kindergarten bus the previous day. So instead of Todd experiencing the school becoming an aquarium, he spends half of the episode in a lifeboat in a very boring looking scene. It's blue on the ground and a yellow background. That is it. And he ends up stuck with Marissa, who we will get to. Out of 28 choices, I have no idea why they picked Todd. If you wanted a new student, the books already had a new student. In the second book, Benjamin Nushmut is introduced. His thing is that everyone thinks his name is Mark Miller. It's a clean slate, and he was very easily the straight man in the book that you wanted. If you wanted a character that's more normal than the rest of the gang, which wasn't Todd in the book, that would be Allison. If you wanted a male main character that could have been considered a straight man, honestly, you could have picked Myron. The Myron in this cartoon is an insult to the character from the books. The only thing they got right is that he used to be a class president, and they overblew one tiny little episode into his basic entire character. Do you know what caused him to lose that position in the books? He was walking home when Dana's dog was hit by a car, and so he walked 2 miles to the vet, carrying the dog all the way there. He was only late the next day and lost his position because he took the extra effort to check on Dana's dog and make sure that she was okay. In the Wayside television series, Myron is selfish and lazy, to the point where not even fans of the show seem to like him. While he's not the worst character that I've ever come across, there's not much redeeming about him. I seriously do not know how they made this connection, or why they did this to Myron's character. It doesn't have any benefit for the show. Literally every episode about Myron is focused on him going on some kind of power trip, or trying to attain power. It does get repetitive and old quite quickly. In fact, he seems to have taken on the personality of another character from the book, Joy. Just a more stupid version of Joy, who was basically one of the classroom stock assholes. And Joy was Marissa's friend in the series, so it would make sense if at some point that was the original inception. Dana's personality they invented from whole cloth, and I'm not too fond of her character either. I've seen this personality type frequently before, the stuck to the rules to the point of obsession. I mean, her catchphrase is, "enough with the fun," which isn't really something you should be saying in a cartoon, let alone a cartoon based on the Wayside books. And finally, we get to Marissa to round out our main cast. In the books, she was a girl who liked ice cream. They went from that to a tomboy on roller skates that punches Todd a lot. I mean, the books did say that she could beat up any boy in Mrs. Jewell's class, but it didn't say that she actually did it. Her most shining moment from the book is when she returned $20,000 to its owner out of the kindness of her heart. In the show, her most defining moment is when she hit Todd. Yeah, apparently Wayside follows the Miss Teacher Person brand of logic where you're supposed to hit the ones you like. I wouldn't be surprised if Marissa grew up to be Miss Teacher Person. While the books weren't about the morals, and frequently told stories that ended on a bizarre note, they never taught or showcased anything that's quite honestly this abhorrent. In the first book, for instance, one of the characters, DJ, gives the eternal message that you need a reason to be sad, you don't need a reason to be happy, which is why he was always smiling. The relationship between Todd and Marissa isn't funny or endearing, not even through warped Wayside logic. It's just off-putting watching Marissa be an asshole and Todd getting hit around. Mrs. Jewell's class had 27 and later 28 students in the book. In the show, she has about 12. And some of the characters make me think that they were only skimming through the book. The only one that they got 100% right was Sherry. John doesn't stand on his head. In fact, in the books, it's explicitly stated that he couldn't stand on his head. He could only read things that they are upside down until he flipped his brain and then everything became upside down for him. Stephen only wore a Halloween costume to school once, and that was the Friday before Halloween. The series has an odd habit of taking one tiny joke from one chapter and ballooning it to eclipse who the characters actually are. Jenny didn't ride a bike everywhere, she just wore a motorcycle helmet and had an odd habit for coming to school on a Saturday. I wouldn't mind too much, except Ed, Edd, and Eddy came out around the same time and she's basically a nicer version of Kevin. The bikes almost look the same, and anyone who's read the book knows that making BB without Calvin is like making Mr. Burns without Smithers. Yes, when transferring something to another medium, you do need to make changes, but these are almost random and haphazard, and the lack of benefits you get from these changes don't outweigh losing the charm from the original books. I cannot stress this enough, these changes only make the product worse. You want to talk about effort if we're just counting the amount of characters that made it into the show, based on the characters from the book series. Even if they're just sitting in the background, this show has gotten 14 out of 28 of the students. That is half, and in school, 50% is still a failing grade. These characters have very simplistic designs. I'm sure you could have spent another 2 hours making some more background characters. The show had 26 episodes, which is 52 cartoon segments. The original book managed to convey 27 students within 30 chapters that are all much shorter. So, what did Wayside, the cartoon, use to fill its time?
What a turnout to witness their principal break his own personal record of a triple sow cow twist.
Ah yes, Mr. Kidswatter, the guy who wasn't even in the first book. Not that he's a bad character, but he takes up so much screen time in the show. I think that he gets even more screen time than Mrs. Jules, which is the classroom teacher. If we're talking adaptation points, in the book he was mean and intimidating, and the students actually feared him, while he still made absurd demands like banning the word door because it kept running into them. Half of the episodes seem to involve him or give him a subplot, while sacrificing half of the students from the original books. And the books were about the students. This would be like cutting Alice out of Alice in Wonderland entirely to tell the epic story of the Dormouse. But I think I know why they did it. It's easy. For starters, he's basically a grown-up Myron. A joke that Myron would make could work coming from Kidswatter. Make Myron act like a dumbass and you're done. Make Kidswatter act like a dumbass, you're done. What you focus on is what your work is about. And the Wayside School stories were not about Principal Kidswatter. He was a secondary character at best. He may have been the catalyst for a chapter, like installing the elevators, but he was rarely, if ever, involved with the plot. In one episode based on a book chapter, Music Lessons, all that Kidswatter did was tell Mrs. Jules that her music was so loud that no one else could hear. Mrs. Jules decided to fix that by playing louder so everyone could hear. In the cartoon episode Music Lessons, beyond being another Myron power trip episode, it's a quest for Kidswatter to get to the 30th floor and stop Myron's instrument, which ends up hypnotizing the students. The biggest difference from the books is that in the television show, the environment drives the weirdness. In the books, the characters drive the weirdness. And if they wanted to go that route, that would have been fine, but they shouldn't have done that if they didn't want to put any effort into their characters. I've seen the Kidswatter type of character before, the childish authority figure. It's been done. A lot. When half of your episodes and half of the screen time of all of the other episodes are about a character type that's been done to death, it doesn't look very good for your show. A lot of the episodes do have good ideas that I could imagine being in the books, like Teacher-Parent Conference, like Age of the Aquarium, where they flooded the school to experience what it's like to be in an actual aquarium. The issue with the show is the execution. They focus on the wrong characters that they've reduced to one-note jokes. Marissa being sent to Wayside Honors Class could be really interesting with Wayside logic, but because they don't have a budget to make it interesting, they have it taught by Miss Mush, who is not very interesting. And this is just a side note, if you want to keep her country of origin vague like say Rolf, you can't be referring to things that actually exist, like pierogies for instance, which are decidedly Polish. Actually, you could probably throw her into the Kidswatter problem. It's pretty much the same, and she gets a lot more screen time than she should. The Wayside students protesting something could lead to a lot of interesting interactions between the students. But way too much of that episode is focused on Kidswatter being Kidswatter. No, wait. He's not being Kidswatter, he's just being a dumbass. Many of the stories are pulled from the book. Not anything as intense as Dana's dog getting hit by a car, or Myron contemplating sacrificing security for freedom, or a substitute teacher contemplating throwing a baby out of a 30-story window, or Marissa having a moral dilemma of whether or not to keep a large sum of lost money. Because taking kids seriously isn't part of the job here. The books could occasionally get pretty dark. One chapter was about a substitute teacher who would steal the children's voices and use it to make calls to their parents, basically insulting the parents in their children's voices and threatening them that they would never get their voices back. The first chapter of the first book, someone gets turned into an apple and gets eaten. At times, the Wayside show feels like the opposite of one of those obnoxiously gritty reboots, except still obnoxious. And when they do decide to actually go with something that was in the books, they seldom get it right. There's even an example in the title of the first episode. It's called Pull My Pigtail. And the episode is about Principal Kidswatter doing something stupid.
Hey, what's with the shouting? Who are you? Wait, no, don't tell me. I know. You're my guardian angel.
You're what?
Guardian angels protect people. That means I can do anything when you're around and you'll save me. I got it. I can jump off a tree and you'll save me, right? Okay, here I go, guardian angel. Come now and save me.
But it's also about Dana trying to get Todd to pull Marissa's ponytail, in an episode called Pull My Pigtail. Leslie is one of the kids you decided to keep, and this is all very aggravating to me. The episode is called Pull My Pigtail, despite having nothing to do with pigtails, because in the book, one of the characters, Paul, struggled with not pulling Leslie's pigtails. It's okay if we entirely remove him and give everything he does to another character. Cabbage, my boy, is based on Bebe getting away with everything because she lies about a fake little brother doing things. The episode is about everyone thinking that Myron's cabbage is his little brother as it continues to rot, and one of the few times that I'm glad that the show has piss-poor animation. One of the main deciding factors in whether or not you like the show seems to be whether or not you read the books. And yes, a good chunk of my complaints are adaptation-based. But I don't think that I'd like the show even if I had never touched the books. Because, well, it's all very stock. At best. Characters that aren't horrible like Myron are like Dana. Character types that I've seen a million times and they don't do much interesting with it. Like I said, I've seen the childish idiot authority figure a million times. And then there are the plots. While there are interesting and more surreal episodes, there are a lot of plots that have been done before. Repeatedly to the point of being cliche. Adult needs to go back to school to graduate. Never seen that before. A weird person giving up their eccentricities for an episode. Never seen that before. A Christmas episode where someone learns not to be a selfish prick. What do you know? The animation reminds me of Johnny Test, and I can't stand the main characters. Todd is just a butt monkey, Marissa's gimmick of punching him gets old, and Myron is lazy and selfish and every episode about him is the same.
I will admit, it's hard for me to separate my feelings on the show from these books. These books were a part of my childhood, and they were actually a very big inspiration to me. An inspiration for eventually writing my own book. This series really inspired my own children's literature tone and style. And where I'd be is probably a lot different if these books didn't exist. They're rather unique in their own style. What gets me a lot is that in my original review, a lot of people will say that they've never read the books, but they like the TV series. And that's fine and good, but if you do like the TV series, I implore you to at least check out the books. You might like them, you might not. But I find them better in pretty much every way. They're unique and funny, and rereading them again for this review, they still do hold up quite well. They're not perfect, but they have effort and passion, and they take kids seriously. Unlike the TV series, which seems to be just trying to get a quick buck, while spending absolutely nothing to do it.
The Wayside series was the first book series to truly leave an impression on me as a kid. It may have been the first chapter book that I've ever read. And it was definitely the first series that ever inspired me, even before the likes of Harry Potter. It is most likely the first domino in the lineup of my decision to be a writer, and the kind of writer that I would eventually be. Wayside, the animated series, is also another kind of inspiration to me. The I must never be this bad kind of inspiration. The I have to do better than this kind of inspiration. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be this. I don't want to make something like this. I don't want to create something that takes these amazing characters or wonderful ideas and create something awful or even mediocre that never realizes the full potential of the idea. And that might sound like it only applies to adaptations, but what is a book or a movie or a video game or anything creative but an adaptation of one or more ideas? Everything I've ever written is an adaptation of an idea. Everything I ever will write is an adaptation of an idea. Same with you. To tell you the truth, this series makes me more sad than angry. The books seem to be way more obscure than they have any right to be. The series reportedly has sold around 6 million copies, which in the grand scheme of things isn't much since 1978. It's not bad by any means, and I myself would be lucky to ever achieve something like that in 30,000 years, let alone 30. But the Wayside books don't seem to have punctuated the consciousness as much as, say, the works of Roald Dahl, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory or Matilda. And yes, I am holding this show partially responsible for that. A good or bad adaptation can make all of the difference. Harry Potter and Hunger Games, while they were successful in their own right beforehand, only really broke out into the mainstream after their respective movie franchises took off. And after, say, the failure of The Last Airbender, I wouldn't say that the Avatar franchise has been treated with the utmost respect. Imagine if that movie was good. Avatar might have as much of the cultural holding power as The Hunger Games, and Nick might not have been tempted to shuffle around the episodes, screw over the creators, and then shove the rest of it to video streaming, to get it out of the way as quickly as possible. Adaptations have an effect on the original product. I won't say that people don't read books anymore, but it's generally not what they do first. People will go to the easiest consumed version of the work first. People will watch a movie before they will watch a television show, and they will watch a television show or a movie before a book or graphic novel, and that can paint their overall view of the franchise. All of these movies, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Jurassic Park, The Shining, Rambo, Roger Rabbit, The Never-Ending Story, Willy Wonka. How many of these things do you only know through their adaptation? In some of these cases, you might not even realize that they're an adaptation. Would Wayside be an animated atrocity if it was its own thing? That's hard to answer. I'd put it better than Johnny Test, but only just because of its concepts and its premises, which it didn't come up with. And even beyond that, there is a higher bar when it comes to adaptations. Bad adaptations do disastrous things to studio, network, and public perceptions of a work. And honestly, it's kind of worse when they're mediocre, rather than outstandingly bad. When something bombs as bad as Last Airbender, people tend to think that there's no way that what it's based on could be that bad. When it's mediocre, like the Silent Hill movie or Wayside, audiences don't have that question. And not many people see it, and it leads to networks thinking that the product doesn't have an audience. As much as I complained about the differences, I wouldn't be angry if the show did its own thing and did it well. It's not always about sticking as close as possible to the source material. Compare the two versions of The Shining movie, Kubrick's to King's. King's is much closer to the book, but Kubrick's is often considered much, much better. The job of an adaptation is about transcribing that something special from the original and making it resonate with a new medium, not obscuring what made the original great. I honestly feel that with another try, with someone who knows what they're doing, or actually, cares about the books, and is not just basically copying someone else's homework, a Wayside television series could seriously work out. It really does lend itself to the medium of animation. As I said, it has a cartoon-like tone, and it's already episodic. But because this series got mediocre reviews and was canned 2 seasons in, good luck finding a network that'll think that it's a good idea. And from what I hear, Louis Sacker, the writer of the Wayside books, didn't like the series very much, and might be hesitant to sign up for this song and dance again. Which is sad. But who knows? There's always hope. Wayside isn't the only series of his that has had an adaptation, and he's still writing. From what I understand, the movie Holes, which is also based on another book of his, turned out very well. So who knows? We can only hope for the best.
Let's go,